Hey, how's it going everybody? I hope you're all good. My name is Peter and today I'd like to put forward some of the things I'd like to see in the upcoming sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Seeing as this highly anticipated follow-up to the 2017 title will most likely be a while away, I figured I'd talk about some of the things that I think could either be expanded or improved upon. Despite Breath of the Wild being my second favourite Zelda game after Wind Waker, there's definitely some things that the sequel could do to make it even better. So, let's not waste any more time and get into it. The first thing I'd like to see, which I think is safe to say will be one of the more realistic ideas, is the addition of new rune abilities to play around with. While the ones we already have in Breath of the Wild are great fun to use and allow the player to experiment with the game's physics, I think it makes perfect sense to see some additional abilities from the Sheikah slate on top of what we've already seen. Typically, a direct sequel will have more of everything. A perfect example of this being how each new Pikmin game introduces new Pikmin types on top of the existing ones. It only makes sense as a way to expand on what's already great. Perhaps there could be a rune that replicates the purpose of the hook shot from previous Zelda titles, or maybe one that allows you to play around with the different elements, Avatar style. Some of these ideas might be very situational, but I think an increased variety of runes makes natural sense for an idea that the sequel can build upon. Next up, I'd like to see a wider variety of interesting dungeons. This was one of my personal main complaints I had about Breath of the Wild. This was because the divine beasts we did get were the closest we had to actual dungeons. While the shrines also provided interesting puzzles with a nice prize at the end, the divine beasts were the main dungeons that pushed the plot forward, and personally, I found them to be a bit underwhelming. I did like the idea of being in control of its movements to help progress, but I think it's kind of a shame that the interior of each divine beast looked awfully similar to each other, and exploring each one just felt a bit repetitive as a result. It also doesn't help that the bosses you encounter at the end of each one also look very similar, to the point where I wouldn't be able to tell you their names without looking it up on the Zelda wiki first. Something which I will come back to in a bit. It is for this reason why I'd like to see a return to what the dungeons were like in the previous 3D Zelda games. Of course, the method of puzzle solving should consist of multiple solutions and encourage players to think outside the box like in the original, but I really want to see these dungeons actually be thematically connected to the world of Hyrule, rather than being a group of giant mechanical contraptions that feel a bit disconnected to the environments they are found within, at least in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier, I was also a bit disappointed with the boss fights at the end of each Divine Beast. They all took some sort of form of Calamity Ganon and practically looked the same, plus the method of defeating them, at least from my experience, just depended on wailing on them until their health was fully depleted. I could be wrong, as I don't even remember them all that much from when I first played Breath of the Wild close to its release nearly 4 years ago now. But I think that's a testament to how unmemorable I really think they are. Other bosses from past Zelda games like Ocarina of Time or A Link Between Worlds have some really fun and interesting bosses that I honestly miss, and I wish this type of boss design would return. Obviously, these past bosses pretty much have a definitive weakness that the game intended for you to discover and exploit, typically with the item you found within the same dungeon, so naturally these new bosses would also be designed with Breath of the Wild's experimental gameplay in mind. The actual mini-bosses that you can find in the overworld have the right idea if you ask me. Ranging from Stone Talus to Molduga and Hinox, they all had distinct designs and mannerisms that made them feel unique from one another. I also felt there were more ways you could approach when it came to taking them on. For example, for Stone Talus, you could try and blow up its arms with remote bombs to make it easier for you to climb up their back to wail on the crystal, or alternatively, you could try and keep a safe distance while waiting for an opening to simply shoot arrows at the crystal, and you could still see success in doing so. If the actual dungeon bosses took a bit of inspiration from these mini-bosses, as well as bosses from past Zelda adventures, I really think it would create some truly memorable fights that I've come to expect from the series, and would definitely surpass the bosses from the 2017 original. Now, let's address an area that Breath of the Wild gets a fair amount of criticism for, and that is how the story itself was executed. The story, for the most part, was told through optional flashbacks of what happened 100 years prior to the events leading up to the game, and I perfectly understand why fans found this rather lackluster. I think the intention was that Nintendo didn't want to just force feed the story down our throats and allow us to discover it for ourselves, which I totally get, but I found the story a bit jarring when any scene that's supposed to be of emotional impact is one that happened long ago, rather than the present we are in now. I think considering Breath of the Wild's structure, the direction they took with the story does make sense, but I'd like to see more of a focus on the present time for this next one. I get that Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity actually puts us in that time period of 100 years ago, but I'm hoping this new Zelda game won't have to require a Warriors spin-off to tell its story, as I'd rather it just be fully told in the actual mainline game. Maybe that's just my bias, as I'm not really a fan of Warriors styled games, but I hope what I'm saying makes sense here. Now that I think about it, the flashbacks did sort of remind me of the scanning feature from the Metroid Prime series, as it allows you to seek out the world lore without it being forced on you if you're not all that interested, but it's available if you happen to be. As a side note, perhaps the Sheikah Slate could do something a bit similar where you can scan your surroundings and get a description, while also being given more enticing rewards the more times you do it. It could make it a bit more interesting than just taking pictures of everything for the sake of filling in the Hyrule Compendium, if you ask me. So, those were some of my ideas for what I think the Breath of the Wild sequel could add. I hope you've enjoyed it. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you looking forward to the sequel, or do you have any ideas of your own? I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, see you later.